Um, so there's something about evolution. We end up with more sophisticated, not always, but generally more sophisticated forms. So form emerges through an evolutionary process. Why is it that physics and evolution seem to be saying completely different things? And Prigogine got the Nobel Prize for this work for basically recognizing that for open systems, that is situations that are in relationship with their wider environments, that we move into this area of non-equilibrium thermodynamics and find that order emerges locally. And he was very inspired by the Belousov-Sabatinski reaction. And interestingly, Prigogine, although he worked in Brussels, was Russian. And this work, which hadn't been translated by that time out of Russian, was Belousov and Sabatinski were Russians. And they were discovering these kind of dynamic patterns emerging and then shifting in the surfaces of liquids that were kind of held in tension by certain chemical reactions, that they were able to operate as open systems. So we in one fell swoop connect the mechanics of a mechanical system, thermodynamics and evolution, through this one word open, and find that we have this real emphasis on patterning. So new patterns can self-organize and new characteristics can emerge that are shaped by the particularities of the situation and its history and are dynamic. So it was all kind of there in that one sentence. So one of the things I wanted to try and emphasize more clearly, I think, than I have in Embracing Complexity is, what are the conditions for complexity? In other words, what are the conditions for the emergence and stabilizing and dissolving of patterns of relationships? And I want to say a bit more about patterning. So we've got three conditions. One of them is that situations are open to the wider context, that they can exchange energy, matter, information. So even, you know, if you take the patterning in a family, you know, if you enclosed something like that, you know, and there was no interactions with the outside world, it would eventually kind of run down and dissolve. You know, people literally would starve to death and you know, and so on. But there's something about how there's an energizing of the patterning of relationships. And by patterning in human systems, I mean things like culture, the norms of behaviours, the way things are done, who relates to who in a family. It's always fascinating, isn't it, that you look at how family dynamics emerge, and how maybe in terms of open systems, you know, if Great Auntie Mabel comes to visit, you know, the children start splitting off and doing something different, you know, the dynamics change again. So we've got this idea of patterning and this importance of being open to the wider context. The second point is that things, and we'll come back to what a thing is, or indeed if there is a thing, are interconnected, and relationships between them are reflexive, reflective, with the possibility of feedback. So what stabilizes patterns is this reflexive interaction between what's there. That's an important issue. And then the third point is that there's variation, messiness, diversity, change. And really, it was this focus on evolution and Darwin's work that really changed and brought in some of the ideas of process philosophy. And Darwin seems to be the first person who really said messiness is necessary for change. It is messiness that and variation that both creates the potential for stability and creates the potential for change. So that's really, really interesting, I think. So I think my more recent view of how I describe what complexity is the emergence, stabilizing and dissolving of self-organizing patterns of relationships. And when I say self-organizing here, that's not to say that things like leadership or, you know, a shock from the outside doesn't have an impact. They do have an impact. We're not excluding them, but there's something about this kind of reflexive interweaving of what's there, including these shocks and external things, that both paradoxically help things to stabilize but also are part of what creates emergence and destruction. And I think we have to, remember that destruction is part of this evolutionary process as well. So another way of describing this, and this is in the book Embracing Complexity, is that what Prigogine in particular really emphasized in complexity thinking, and doesn't come out of the more the idea that complexity is kind of deterministic. It's just very messy and complicated, but if we had the bits, then we could kind of get there. He was really, and I think Peter Allen in particular really brought this point out very well, although it's in Prigogine's early writing as well, is that we're interested in these patterns, and we're interested in how these patterns get disturbed or created or shifted or even sustained. So there's a dance between what is called in the book patterns and events. And systems thinking sometimes can create the idea of, if we understand the systemic patterns, then we have everything we need to know, and then we can kind of decide what to do. But it doesn't always bring out the theory of the dynamics of the situation, that we're looking for what's emerging, what's shifting, what's changing, what's creating change is as important as what's there. So the complexity theorist, in doing a diagnostic, and I'll talk about that later, is both interested in what are the patternings that we need to be interested in at the level of society, at the level of organization, at our own level, at the level of the person. But also, are we noticing and understanding what are the critical junctures? What is the variation that matters? Are there emerging shoots of change? And you need to have this both and thinking about that. So we have this idea of an emerging future that's systemic and patterned. It's not just systemic. It's not just saying everything's entangled. It's saying, well, yes, things are kind of potentially entangled, but they often separate into patterns, and then some things are more entangled than others. So it isn't just a kind of globalized idea of entanglement or the sort of interconnectedness of things. Sensitive to history and context, dynamic, episodic, by which I mean that change isn't incremental and linear, it goes in fits and starts. Emergent, and this idea of not deterministic, that the complex world cannot be pinned down by a set of analytical equations, however hard you try, is the assertion here. So, somebody saying something, or yeah, no, okay. So I'm really, one of the things that has really interested me the last few years is how these ideas pop up all over the place. It's not that complexity theories reinvented the universe and it's all new and modern and nobody said it before. And I really like this idea of ontological resonance with other things. So Leibniz, for example, who had great discussions and there are letters. I've got a book, she says, pointing over there, which is the kind of correspondence between Leibniz and Clarke, who was one of Newton's students. And Leibniz was constantly pointing out to Newton, in contrast to this idea that, the universe is really a machine, and providing we set, God set off the universe as a machine, and then it's all kind of tootled along happily since then. Leibniz was saying, but what about the patternings of the universe? Why is the solar system here and not here? Why has it got these planets and not those planets? Why is the solar system flat? And Newton's answer in the queries to the optics, when asked why the solar system is flat, was that God periodically patted it back into place. So there's something about this primacy of the patterning of the universe, which, as cosmologist Lee Smolin said, the fact that we live in a universe of structures at so many scales is so commonplace, so manifest, that it's easy to miss its significance. So it feels like for many physicists, they talk about universal theories and then they try and connect up the theories. And that's obviously got a place. I have that background. I understand its place, but we mustn't forget that there is a truth, a reality about the patterning and the particularity of things from the universe right down to the fact that, you know, you can classify me as much as you like, but I'll always be Jean, and there won't be anybody else quite like me, and the same as you. Similarly, that there are things that we could say about the inner patterning, and there's a book by Jeremy Lent you might have come across called The Patterning Instinct, which looks very much at the kind of the evolution of the inner patterning of how we think about things, which I'd recommend, but it is this thick. You just need to know. There's something about patterning as well and this idea that's a Buddhist idea about the emptiness of patterns, and what that really is saying is that it's important, and it's something you know that people who know me well will know. I always get rather hot under the collar about reifying the idea of systems, that systems exist. There's something about the emerging of patterning, and that they can be systemic, but patternings are held together by the relationships between things. And I was completely thrilled when I heard the Dalai Lama at a talk in Nottingham in 2008. I was there, and I scribbled this down, basically saying this: forms and feelings are devoid of inherent existence. It's only on the basis of the aggregation of subtle elements that forms exist. Forms can only be understood in relational terms to their constitutive elements. Now, you know, that is complexity theory, and it's very exciting to hear this sophisticated language coming out of Buddhism. Similarly, with Lee Smolin, the properties of things are not fixed. Absolutely, they arise from the interactions and relationships among the things in the world. Integrity is something becoming whole in its co-created relationships with other things. So there's a focus here and quantum gravity moves this even further on some more recent interpretations of quantum theory itself, is that the truth, in a sense, the reality is in the relationship. It's not in the thing. It's a kind of relational view. And even me as a thing, you know, I can see myself as a thing. But the truth is, I'm constituted by my relationships, by my environment. What I've become is due to all those relationships. But actually, I'm held in my relationships, and you know how I'm behaving now is in relationship to you. I can see Sharon nodding away there, which is very reassuring. You know, that's feeding back on me and what I'm saying, and we are constitutive of our relationships. So I think that's really interesting. So very briefly, to take this a little bit further into what I'm trying to say in talking about process complexity. Although traditional complexity theory makes the working assumption that there are things connected by forces reflectively, and this can lead to patterns, the emphasis on things is really just a computational convenience. I don't think even in the kind of traditional complexity theory, anybody would feel like ignoring mood or the wind or you know, atmosphere. And I do write about that a bit in Embracing Complexity. But computationally, we think about things connected by forces because we don't quite know what else to do. But we can understand things, this idea of something that exists, as interpenetrating patterns, which may be fleeting or persistent. So this moves into what you can call in physics a field theory perspective. It's also used in Gestalt theory. The Gestalt people talk about field theories as well. So we are interested more in this sort of loosening of the idea of a thing. And it's more like ripples or waves or whirlpools on a river. They're distinguishable. So there is a wave there, and you'd think there was a wave there as well. We might argue a bit about where the edges of the wave was, but they are interpenetrating. So if we look at waves on the sea or waves in a river, their interaction with the tides, with the wind, they're mutually affecting each other. They sustain for different timescales. Raindrops cause a different kind of ripple than you know the tide or the flow down of the river, and they're impacted by context, history, and are in flow. So there's no real separation, and this is a big leap, and it may be that I can send you this paper if you're interested. There's not really a separation between things and forces. If you look at the electromagnetic field, or sound waves. You can't really say what's a thing and what's a force. There's no real separation. And in the same way, there's no real separation between patterns and events. A short pattern may be an event if you happen to be a long pattern. But if you're something else on the time scale, then it may be a very real pattern. So that's really kind of interesting. And the ontology of complexity becomes processual, with its focus on the minutiae of detail and how that leads to patterning or wholes forming and dissolving. Now, when I say that, I'm not suggesting in this processual worldview that it's just like a flow with no structure, no features in it. We're still focusing on the fact that in many cases, in relatively stable situations, we can actually describe and understand a lot of what's going on in a team or an organization or an economy through the relatively stable patterns that are there. But it's having the notion that however stable you think those patterns are, they're actually in process. They're in process of changing into something else, depending on the time scale. So don't hear me saying, I've turned everything into, it's all complex and all we've got is a flow of undifferentiated, inchoate material. I'm not trying to say that. So again, in terms of resonances with other ideas, I was, completely thrilled to find a book by Carlo Rovelli, who's a quantum gravity person and is very well worth listening to, where he says, the world is made up of events, not things. Even the things that are most thing-like are nothing more than long events. The world is not so much made of stones as of fleeting sounds or waves moving through the sea. So you can imagine me cheering when I read that. Exactly the same sentiment in Taoism, a particular translation of the Tao Te Ching by Ames and Hall, which I love. I go back to this particular translation time and time again. Particular things are in fact processual events and are thus intrinsically related to other things. These processual events are porous, flowing into each other in the ongoing transformation we call experience. Now, Rovelli wouldn't argue with that. That's written about stuff coming from the 5th century BC. Similarly, with Hinduism. Okay, so that's my kind of. I think I'm going to go on a little bit further and then pause for some questions and comments and make sure we leave ourselves enough time to talk about practice too. But I want to say a little bit about ontological indeterminism. So the roots of this indeterminism in physics come from different areas, really. So in thermodynamics, there's this idea of time's arrow. We can't go backwards. If we watch a film and we played it backwards, we'd know that the film was being played backwards because, people would come alive again or houses would rebuild themselves or whatever. So there's something about this path dependence that comes out of the understanding of thermodynamics, which says that all the possible states that the future could hold are not all visited by reality or by what actually happens. And when in a sense, one path has been selected and not others, the potential for that path has gone. So we're irreversibly changing what's going on through the kind of selection process, not us humans selecting things, but that things happen in nature that mean that this happened, and having that happened, it precludes the other possible things that could have happened happening. So there's more. I can send you the paper if you're interested in that. So that sort of thermodynamics idea is what kind of confounds people who are looking for unified field theories in physics. And Jim Al-Khalili, for example, was saying recently, people focus very hard on how gravity connects with the quantum world, or how the quantum world connects with electromagnetism, but thermodynamics, in a sense, this issue of the particularity of things and the fact that energy loses kind of messes up all these universal and precise theories, which doesn't mean that they don't have their place. You know, obviously quantum theory took us enormously forward in terms of understanding things on various scales. You know, oh dear, my brain's gone now, but some very measurable outcomes of quantum physics. So it's not that it's wrong, but it's just we're not going to be able to, this suggests, connect it all up neatly, because we're always going to be confounded by thermodynamics. So that's one route into this. There's also something about quantum physics, which people know about the uncertainty principle. What is often not said about the uncertainty principle is it's very precisely deterministic. We know precisely how and in what ways. It's uncertain. What confounds quantum physics is something called the collapse of the wave function. And it goes back to this idea of non-ergodicity here, that when we've selected one of the particular quantum possibilities, then the other ones become unavailable to us. So there's something really central about this idea of irreversibility and its relationship to indeterminism. So this is really, really interesting to me, because it's saying it's not that the complex world can't be known because it's too complicated, but, you know, maybe God could know, or Laplace's demon. What this is saying is there's no such thing in ontological terms as a real, absolute, precise stuff that's either there or not there. There's a sort of paradox within the interstices of things that you can't get rid of. So again, I was terribly excited by William James writing this lovely quote, where he kind of says, you know, and remember everybody, you know, if the universe was already laid down and absolutely appointed, the future would have no ambiguous possibilities hidden in its womb. Wouldn't you like to write like this? I would. The whole is in each and every part. It wells together an absolute unity, an iron block in which there can be no equivocation or shadow of turning. In other words, if we could solve this deterministic problem of physics, there would be absolutely nothing that was ambiguous, and no creativity, no learning, no particularity, no nothing. It would be like we were part of a universe that was like an iron block. Indeterminism, on the contrary, says that the parts have a certain loose play on one another. It admits that possibilities may be in excess of actualities, and things that may, you know, actualities float in a wider sea of possibilities. But as he says, and this is what I was calling non-ergodic, of two alternative futures which we conceive, both may now really be possible, but the one becomes impossible at the very moment when the other excludes it by becoming real itself. So this is, I think, very interesting, this idea of ontological indeterminism, which may not interest you, but as you can see, it interests me. So Taoism also has this idea of indeterminism, and as Ames and Hall say, it's the underdetermined open nature of waymaking that makes it inexhaustibly capacious. You know, that we have novelty because of this open nature, and gives the quite appropriate impression that nothing is perfect or complete. So and indeterminism is what leads to the emergence of novelty. So as Stuart Kauffman said, a complexity theorist, we live in an emergent universe of ceaseless creativity in which life, agency, meaning, consciousness, and ethics have emerged. Our entire historical development has been self-consistent, co-constructing, evolving, emerging, and unpredictable. Same kind of emphasis in Taoism. So let me pause there and stop sharing, because I've probably said enough for a minute. I've got the kind of, you know, the so what does it mean for practice bit next, but any thoughts or comments or questions so far? So I stunned everybody into silence. I shall pick on somebody.
Oh, we have Richard over there with his hand up.
Richard. Hi, Richard.
There's quite a few. That was really great. I just wonder, I think the real world is messy. Let's put it like that. So I'm not discounting that, but it's quite interesting how I think with Prigionin's work and other people in other contexts like Lorentz with complexity. I mean, the Lorentz case is even simpler, where just with an incredibly simple mathematical model, he out comes this really complex pattern. So the message is complexity can jump out at you from sometimes the simplest of situations. And if you get to that chemical reaction where you've got sort of, what about 5 or different chemical reactions interacting, then you've got even more scope for complexity. So I'm just slightly challenging that it needs to be that messy to get complexity to happen, if you get me.
Well, Lorentz was a chaos theory.
Yes, sure, yeah.
And his equations are deterministic. So you can show patterning through the Lorentz equations, but they're entirely deterministic. They're determined entirely from the initial conditions, and issues of self-similarity and fractals that come out of that is challenged by complexity theory. But what so? Yeah, no, the real world has this kind of marriage between it is the need for variation that creates these kind of emergent patterns. And there's quite a discussion in Embracing Complexity. I can send you the chapter if you're interested, about the real distinction between, we can learn something from chaos theory, but it does still present a world that's deterministic. It's just got, it's non-linear, but it's still deterministic. So it is different. Yeah,
absolutely. But if you don't need many Lorentz type things with then a whole lot of random environmental things going on to get complexity and indeterminism, do you?
Well, I think that the kind of the application of chaos theory gives people a sense of certainty, and it has things like, that sensitivity to initial conditions, and it doesn't allow for emergence, for example.
Yeah, I wasn't wanting to obsess about Lorentz. I was just using that as an illustration, really. Yeah. Okay, thanks. Yeah.
Thanks, Richard. I think, Frank, you've got your hand up.
Frank.
Muted at the moment, Frank.
Frank, you're muted.
Muted.
Start again. Thank you, Jane. That was stimulating and enjoyable. Thank you very much. A couple of things that come to mind. I get the impression that you appear to think there's only one kind of systems thinking. I'd like you to comment on that in a moment. The other thing is, as far as I'm concerned, a thing is a thing, and how we interpret that thing is determined by our intellectual, social, etc. environment, it seems to me. And the way that the examples that you gave seem to relate to some form of pattern or model that for you enables, or rather for them, enables to say that what I observe doesn't fit that model. But at the same time, you veered between science and the metaphysical. So you're looking for answers, it seems to me, that probably don't fall into either of those.
Right. Thank you. Well, I don't think there's only one systems theory. I think I'm just trying to suggest that systems thinking is less dynamic. It's more likely to think if we know all the bits, then we can kind of work with the future. There's more of a focus on understanding what is. So people can argue about that, but that's my experience, that systems thinkers are more likely to say what is there, and then we'll use that to work with what we need to do, as opposed to, are we really noticing the dynamic of things changing? The second thing to say is I'm not talking about models. I'm talking about ontology. I'm talking about the nature of the world and the nature of reality. And I'm trying to demonstrate that modern physics resonates ontologically with Taoism and process philosophy. So my interest is just to say, isn't this interesting, guys? There's a resonance. You know, does that strengthen our ontological stance? Do we feel more confident that there's something worth thinking about here? But mine is an ontological quest. It's really, I'm not really interested in modeling. I'm not talking about patterns as models. I'm talking about patterns in my life and patterns in the world. So that's what I'm trying to argue here, to just show how similar the you know, I just think it's fascinating. I remember Peter Allen, who worked with Brigitte, coming back from London 20 years ago, clutching a copy of the Tao Te Ching, and this particular I'm putting over there, this particular copy that I'm so attracted to, saying, look, Jean, I've just been reading the introduction to the Tao Te Ching and it reads like a complexity theory textbook. I can't tell any difference. And that set me off on a quest that came out of that. So anyway, thank you, Frank. That was great. Peter.
So I mean, my own background is in physics, but also in Buddhism. So I'm very interested in what you're saying. I'm just trying to, from a kind of ontological perspective, though. My question is, if we don't, let me put it in a very kind of blunt way. If we don't have determinism, how does the universe decide what to do?
Because it selects the most appropriate response to the context. It's a kind of local response. So I'm not saying, you know, that quantum physics doesn't apply universally and electromagnetism doesn't. But I think what you're asking is a very, very, you know, important question. But what the evolution, the people who think about the universe as an evolutionary process would say is, well, you know, when a situation comes up when there are possibilities that in some sense sometimes it might be created by a random spark. You wouldn't have, if there was no variation in the universe, going right back to the Big Bang, there wouldn't be any planets because there would be kind of a uniformity that happened. So there is a selection process going on, in the same way as you can say, you know, why does this animal emerge here and not that animal? You know, it's a kind of complex combination of context, chance. There's a sort of chance randomness in there. So that would be my answer. One thing just to mention about simplicity, I noticed in the chat a couple of things around that, is one phrase that people use is that simplicity emerges out of complexity. And the way I translate that is there are sometimes patternings that are really fairly stable and quite simple, you know, to understand. If I look at, I've done work, for example, at looking at the culture of one organization compared to another, and I can say something quite sensible in 6 words, you know, with 6 adjectives. You know, sometimes you look at the complex weaving of things, and that what pops out is a simple pattern. But there's a difference between forcing simplicity and sometimes seeing something and going, wow, that's really interesting. I can really say something quite meaningful that's quite simple here. But I've got to know that might not last forever, and it might change into something else. Now, somebody else, Elvira, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
I'm very fascinated. I only understand about half, if at all, of what you say, because I'm a social researcher. I'm an anthropologist. And so one of the things that you just said kind of sparked my interest even more than other parts of your talk, which is you talked about culture. Now, I would strongly argue there's no such thing as culture. There's cultural practices in the plural. And coming off from that, I was wondering, like, when you talk about Hinduism, Buddhism and Taoism and all these kind of very, very big meanings, where, like, and as you quote them also, like, where do you anchor them? Like in like ancient texts, in people's interpretations of ancient texts, who are these people? What kind of dynamics do they follow? And like, how do you make decisions about that? Because that's, of course, quite an important aspect of
Yeah.
how it fits back into something that's quite like Western as a understanding.
Yeah. Well, they're really, really good points, and it is simplistic to talk about culture, and you know, it is an empty concept in itself, and it's much more variable than that. So there's this kind of this tension all the time between capturing the patternings that are there well enough to do something with them, and knowing that you're probably wrong, and that it's more nuanced than that. And one of the things I'll talk about in terms of the practice of this is the need for critical subjectivity, for a sort of criticality, because there's a difference in making an ontological statement about complexity and what that implies epistemologically, which implies a sort of subjectivity. I think the point you read, funnily enough, I'm reading another book by Ames and Hall at the moment about just the point you make, which is how easy it is to interpret Chinese philosophy through a Western mindset. So some of the words, for example, like Tian, T-I-A-N, get translated as heaven. And they're arguing you have to see that word in the context. You have to read it through the Chinese worldview, not through the Western worldview. Or Taoism, the way itself gets translated as a sort of thing that you join, as opposed to a kind of path is made through walking. So you're completely right that when you apply these ideas, you have to, there's a subjectivity and a need for criticality to do it. But that doesn't take away, for me, from the kind of ontological quest, which is about the idea that flow is more true than you know, than thinginess. Somebody I noticed said, you know, surely I'm not arguing that complexity is outside of systems theory. I'm not. I think complexity theory is a systems theory, but it adds a nuance to some ways that people work with systems theory. I have this great argument with Mike Jackson, if you know Mike Jackson ever so often. He you know, I was there's an interview I did with Mike, which I can give you a link to if you're interested, where I was kind of pushing him all the time to say, yes, but, you know, do these things really exist quite so concretely? So if it's a 15-minute interview, so if you're interested, I can send you a link to that.
I'd love to, thank you.
Yeah, lovely. Well, are you all right for me to go on to the next part of this talk then? Is that, oh, two more hands raised. Christina.
I'll take them quickly.
Yes, I was wondering if you gave some thought to how when different, I'll call them orders of complex systems, are interacting on each other, and specifically human complex systems try to plan and influence the outcomes of natural complex systems. But when we add the neuroscience and the irrationality of complex human systems, does that, in your mind, affect how we think of those two different types of complexity from an ontological perspective?
Well, I think that that we distinguish, you know, the human world, the social world, from the environmental world, from the economic world, and the truth is, and it's something I will say a little bit more about, is that they're very complexly woven. You know, that if I make a decision, for example, to, you know, like, what car shall I buy? I'm not making an environmental decision or an economic decision. I'm making a socio-economic, cultural, political decision in what I decide. So that kind of those things are kind of woven from the bottom. And there's been, you know, there's a recent book that's come out with some colleagues of mine about the idea of social environmental systems, you know, that we can't really distinguish these things at the level of the system. We have to see what patternings emerge that may have a socio-economic, political quality to them. So I think, yeah, that we've got to be careful about hierarchies, but they do exist, you know, that there are structures that are co-evolve with each other. I think Han Giels is good on this in terms of looking at the way niches emerge in economic systems, and this kind of the way they interplay, because sometimes, you know, a niche in an economic system may lead to a complete reframing of restructuring, a bit like the pandemic. You know, the pandemic was outside the view of the economists, but you know, it reconstructed more. It had more impact on the global economy than anything else has. It's reconstructed something. So, but good question, Christina. I meant to say there's lots about dragons. Christina's just written a lovely master's thesis where she was using the metaphor of dragons, and the Chinese. I was just reading something about the Chinese are very keen on dragons as an idea of kind of the old and the new and tailing each other. John, can I take your question and then I'll move on?
Okay, three very quick things, and they're not all questions. First thing, when I raised that question about whether complexity theory could be seen as standing outside the system zoo, it never occurred to me that you might be suggesting that. I was simply responding to somebody else's apparent suggestion that you might. The second thing is thing. I think whether or not something is a thing depends on what is meant by the thing, and I think it's very dangerous to actually use the term without actually being clear what is meant. You know, whether it's a noun or a verb or something else. The last thing, just the issue of closure. You were talking about closure earlier, but Ashby drew a distinction between systems which are closed to information and closed to energy. In fact, he decided to redefine cybernetics as study of systems which are open to energy but closed to information.
Yes.
So I just wanted to throw that in there because I just like mentioning Ashby.
Yes. Well, Peter Allen argued with, there's a bit in the book about that Ashby talks about requisite variety, for example, and Peter Allen talks about I forgot what the phrase is now, but he's basically saying that we need more diversity. So because there's emergence, you know, it isn't enough to have requisite variety. You have to have more than that. You have to. That's right. The theory of excess diversity. So that's something to think about. But you're right. Ashby does differentiate between the two, but I don't. I don't differentiate between the two. The thing question. Sorry, John. Did you want to come back?
I just wanted to leap into the defense of Ashby. I don't think his intention was ever that narrow.
No,
there's a huge amount of richness in there. It's followed.
Yeah, no, fair enough. The thingness is just to say, yes, you know, it's useful sometimes to talk about the sun as a thing. You know, it depends on your time scale. But whatever thinginess we have, you know, everything's as the Taoists would say, everything's already in the process of dying. And that's true of the sun on a longer time scale, us and everything else. So it's just to remember, if you want to thingify things, that to remember that they're still only temporary, depending on what time scale you're working with. So that's the thing, but separated by forces gets you a long way. But I'm trying to take things a bit further. Thanks, Richard. Things go ping.
Sorry. Can I just leap in here again, because I don't think the term thing can be narrowed down that much. But I think a process can be a thing. So are you talking in terms of its mortality, its finiteness? I'm going to shut up now because Ian's looking slightly exasperated.
Yes.
No, I think it's context that determines it.
I'm talking about reification. I think it's yeah. So I wouldn't call it, you know, you can call the process a thing. It depends what you mean by thing, but it's the kind of reification is what I'm trying to talk about. So, oh, this is really rich and lots of comments here. So let me kind of go boldly on. So implications for practice. I want to talk for about another 15 minutes, I think, and then again open it up for kind of questions and comments. So one of the things that Paul Cilliers, I think, in particular, really brought home with Complexity, his book Complexity and Postmodernism, that's still a good read. If things are indetermined, then in a sense, every act, every choice is an issue of ethics. That it was something that he really felt strongly. We can never know, you know, in a sense, what's real, what's right. You know, that's a really interesting thing. So, you know, we might talk about, you know, a procurement process as a thing that we can optimize in some sense, but it is inevitably you know, as it's inevitably got an issue of ethics in it. You know, what do we choose to, in science, you know, what do we choose to include, what do we choose to exclude, what are our goals? So it's sort of bringing ethics into the center of even science, which you know, is an interesting idea. And that choices for open social systems are inevitably paradoxical. There's no right answer. Should we do this? Should we do that? You know, how do we balance the short term with the long term? How do we balance efficiency and effectiveness? You know, how do we you know, how do we protect ourselves and yet be open to creativity? They don't have right answers, and I think that bringing that into policy is really important. That they're essentially both paradoxical, emerging, and shifting. I want to talk about the dynamics of context analysis, and I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. And then, Christina, this was the third point is a sense what I was trying to say in answer to you, is that we have to think about the interdependencies all the way down. So some people, in trying to work with complexity thinking, talk about coupling policies. So it's almost like they're coupling things at the high level. But it's at least in principle, we have to think about the fact that things are interwoven at very low levels. In my example of buying a car, I'm not making a social decision and comparing it to an ethical, an environmental decision. That's all woven together in my mind. I don't quite know why I make the decision I do, but it's a complex weave of those kind of things. Something else that I think it really comes out of Taoism and is beautifully expressed in Taoism is this idea that we capture emerging shoots of change early. Do we notice things changing early? Are we attuned to change such that when things come into fruition, we know how to act with them? And Patricia Shaw, there's another interview with her I did. I think she brings this out beautifully as a practice in working with teams and in creating change. How do you attune people to really start to notice things when they are subjective, qualitative, but nevertheless we can at least follow them, and it's something that's very much embedded in Taoism. So. I've got really interested in this recently. It's a kind of Goethean idea as well. I talked about that. So I want to say a little bit more. So this is becoming much more practical now than this rather kind of metaphysical view that I've been sharing so far. And this is the kind of work I would do with groups about, well, how do you develop strategies for engendering systemic change then? And that there are sort of three aspects to this. The first one is always a much more grounded diagnostic than sometimes is done. Then this issue that I was talking about at the beginning of how do you think about when is this a situation or a pattern that I want to strengthen, and when do I think my role is about trying to disturb things. And then something about how we go about the doing part of this. So this really ghastly diagram, somebody's trying to redesign this for me because I'm so awful at diagrams. So apologies for this ghastly diagram here. But what I'm trying to suggest here is that when we're trying to diagnose something, which might be, I get asked sort of ever so often questions like, what should we do in a post-conflict Syria? That was from an NGO, you know, these kind of like, what is the future of the Yemen? You know, these completely impossible to answer questions. How do I go about that? You know, should you, another one that I worked on quite a bit was as a fast moving consumer goods company, should you trade with Myanmar? And if so, in what way? This was, I have to say, prior to the recent military re-coup. But these kind of impossible questions, how do I approach those impossible questions, or how do I go about changing this organization at that level? And I'm always interested in going back to the past before I look at the present. So in what ways is the past embedded in the present? What can I find out about the depth and the longevity of patterns, or whether particular critical junctures, you know, particular events that happen that are in the organizational memory, or the memory of the region that we're looking at. And how do I look, you know, down, look up, look around? So I would always go through a diagnostic phase, which might include, you know, people say, well, how long do you do that for? Well, pragmatically, you know, sometimes because I've run out of time and money to do this, but I would be trying to talk to people who knew about the past. I'd be reading historical documents, you know, I would be informing myself through multiple perspectives, but interested in where things come from. So, for example, in working with somewhere like Syria, in looking at the past, there's very little that people tell you, very little evidence of ethnic violence and ethnic conflict in comparison to the Yemen, where that's been much more part of the history. So a post-Syrian solution doesn't necessarily have to separate people ethnically. Now that, you know, that's obviously a very simplistic, forgive me for my simplistic suggestion, but if I was looking at a company, I might be saying, you know, is their ethical stance just greenwash, or does it go deeper? Where does it come from? How long has it been here? How do I understand the depth of some of that patterning? If I was working with an organization that wanted me to help create theories of change, and they'd had a very bad reaction to a performance management system 5 years ago and everybody hated it, I might not choose performance management as my kind of leading change process. So it's really interesting how we are not attuned to really spending time looking at the past, that when I talk to organizations, all the things I say, that they say, well, you're right, but we never really do that. The idea of going to somebody in the post that used to have your job 5 years ago and asking them what they felt about the region that they were working in, or the organization, would usually never occur to people, or reading really old documents. But it can be hugely rich in informing your understanding of how did the present arrive, and how deep are some of those patternings? Are they really deeply held, or are they newer and looser? So that's something I really would spend time doing, and getting multiple perspectives and using a range of data, including hard data. And the same in looking at the future. I'm both interested in the opinion about the future, but also things like, if I was working, say, in looking at the Yemen, you know, what's the trend in population increase? You know, are there increasing numbers of situations of drought? What are the resources? Are they getting less or not? You know, those kind of questions are this mixture of qualitative and quantitative information, this scenario planning, this foresighting is a really important part of what you're doing, and always looking wider. You know, why didn't the economists notice, you know, that the people who knew about pandemics were telling you that global pandemic was high on the cards? You know, how do we make sure that if we're an economist, we don't just think about economics, or if we're in this market, we don't forget that sometimes people stop buying our product because there's a drought and they have to they have to readdress what they're buying. Do we think systemically enough? Do we think outside the context in which we're working? And the other thing about the future is, do we notice, it's the point I was making earlier, do we notice what is changing? So this is a bit like what I do to everything. This is the inside of my head. This is what I carry about in most of my conversations and how I approach things. And so let me just say that this is all very practical. The second thing that really has struck me is about this idea of a dance between patterns and events, and the issue about, sometimes it's about how do patterns stabilize, it's sometimes about how do patterns dissolve, how do we deliberately try and dissolve patternings. And a question we have to ask ourselves, and these are complex questions, is, I'm trying to change things. I want people to really respond to climate change. What do I do that would be about empowerment, about strengthening particular patterns that are really helpful in engaging with climate change? And to what extent do I want to disturb particular patterns? When is it useful? And how do you do them? How do you have to do different things to different parts of the patternings? And how do you do that? And this idea of strengthening patterns is achieved maybe by connecting up resources, building relationships, weaving intention, sharing information and resources, valuing diversity, capacity building, participation, nurturing, growing shoots, this kind of positive view. And I've done quite a lot of work here in local politics, and there is a kind of camp that says all we need to do is to continually increase participation, continuously hear more voices, and then kind of good will come. There is a kind of natural, there's a view that nature somehow reaches a good answer. And that's certainly a large part of it, but it's not always enough. Sometimes it's the maverick who won't go along with things, or the really determined leader who's actually a good strategic thinker and persuades people, that is what changes things. And if you are too resistant to disturbing elements or to diversity, and it becomes the norm where everybody has to kind of agree and be nice to each other all the time, you can end up with a beige answer or no answer. So it's kind of an interesting issue, and I think a lot is written about systems change that sort of sits in this box, and it's good, but it's not always enough. So to what extent is it about disturbing patterns, and which patterns? Spotting and taking advantage of quirky circumstances. Some of the local change that goes on is quite quirky. It's not about doing a complete review about priorities. It's going, this bloke has got this shop and we can set up a share shop in that because these people can project manage it tomorrow. Why don't we do it? Yes. So there's that kind of quality about disturbance. If nudging, symbolizing, catching the flow, being a maverick, campaigning, piloting, truth-telling, resisting, or indeed growing something new alongside, which is something that Joanna Macy has written about too. Is it enough not to try and attack the status quo, but to try and build something that's newer and better alongside, discuss. So I'm kind of interested in that, and I'd be interested in a minute in your views about that. It's a genuine inquiry. Is that useful? Is that good? Do you agree? What's your experience of trying to change things, those of you that are practitioners on this? And the issue about doing, and those of you who are old enough will know who said do-be do. So I have a fridge magnet that says something like, Kant said to be is to do, Descartes said to do is to be, Frank Sinatra said do-be do. And so this is in the do-be do. When is the doing about holding and doing nothing? When is it about waiting? When is it about just holding the space for things to settle or to emerge? How we need to review what our inner world as well as our outer world. The need, this kind of subjective epistemic, this epistemological uncertainty, whether or not you agree with my ontological uncertainty, it's hard not to disagree with the epistemological uncertainty in our social and natural world. So the need for multiple perspectives, the need for judgment, the need of the use of critical subjectivity to kind of chart a way forwards, and to know we're always going to be wrong. You know, to some extent, there is no right answer, and we won't, and even if there was, we won't get it. So how do we take more humility in our decisions and not think that if we just analyze all this, we'll know what to do? How do we weave intentions and get people alongside? How do we pilot, customize, adapt, all those kind of things? So that's the kind of pragmatic view of doing. So before I go on to just a little final section about the inner and the outer world, I just want to go back to this diagram here and this kind of idea of strengthening and disturbing patterns. And I think I'm going to have to stop sharing, or we won't be able to see each other to have a proper discussion. But does that ring true? Is that helpful to people looking at change? You know, is that do you have any reactions to that? Peter?
Yes, just that does make a lot of sense. I just made a point in the chat that this notion of growing something new alongside is the kind of disruption model of industrial change. You know, like the personal computer disrupted the mainframe and all that kind of process.
Yeah.
That certainly happens a lot.
Yeah, no, lovely. Sharon?
Yeah, I love it, and I was thinking absolutely strengthening disturbing patterns from within, and you know, how do we do that with, you know, limited knowledge of the whole when we're in the system? So I love the questions that you're posing. I do have a question as well, if I could ask that now, which is, I love, you know, you talked about diagnosis, looking at the past, present, future, and how important the past is. What order do you look at those in, or is it the sort of dancing metaphor back in play between, you know, past, present, future?
I tend to start with the past, because people, you know, so the kind of questions I might get asked is something about organisation change, or it might be these kind of big policy questions about, you know, what should our policy be about dealing with the future of Syria in a post-conflict Syria, for example. So I always start with the past. And to give you another example of that is before Syria blew up, it was 47th in a list of fragile states, i.e. nobody thought it was fragile at all. And the measures of stability that they were using were present measures. So it was asking, like, does it have universities? Does it have roads? You know, does it have a working economy? And the answer to all those things was all yes. But if you looked at the dynamics of change, then you started to see things about increasing drought, loss of a social, an economic safety net when Assad the Younger adopted neoliberal policies, as opposed to Assad the Elder, who'd adopted much more of a kind of socialist form of autocracy. So if you start looking at those trends from the past, you would get a very different view about, is this potentially, you know, about to blow up? So that I would start with the past, but a good question. Well, I want to bring in Susan Canny here. Now Susan's just sent me a very lovely paper on the application of complexity to conservation of elephants in Mali, and I highly recommend that. I don't know whether you can put a link, Susan, to that in the chat, but what was your question or comment, Susan?
Yes, I can certainly put a link. I apologies, I haven't got a camera at the moment, but I was just going to say that you know, when it comes to, if you're wanting to shift the system from situation to another, it seemed, or at least it seemed to me in trying to do that, that as well as, you know, trying to encourage all the aspects of the system that are supporting your change, you need to also act against the ones that are acting against your change. So those two things are imperative to do together. But to be able to do that, you have to have a certain kind of understanding of that system. So you've got to spend a long time, a certain amount of time, trying to get under the skin and always realizing that you never really know enough. You know, there's always more to learn. And so to learn, and because, you know, I think a key helpful aspect is acknowledging that you don't know really how this system is going to respond. And that helps you be a little bit cautious about trying things out, seeing how it responds, testing in some area, and then adapting to that. So it's a continual process of engagement in terms of you can't really say job done. It's always ongoing. And then the other aspect that I'd be interested in your thoughts, because in terms of, you know, if we're, because I believe this is an essential kind of approach to dealing with the sort of wicked, complex problems that we're confronted with these days. We can't use simplistic methods anymore. So in terms of how do you make that change, it seems a lot depends on the sort of, how can I say it better, the wisdom of the people making those decisions. And that sort of links to what you're saying about the inner outer aspects of this. You can't somehow separate out, much as being the scientist, and I'm, you know, scientist trained, you know, you're trained to try and be objective, and you're looking for objectivity, and you'll look for replicability. But there seems to be that when you're trying to make a change in systems, there's an inevitable element of the internal, you know, what is the personal qualities of those people trying to make that change, if you see what I mean.
I do. I think that's a lovely point. And I remember in you working, you know, on elephant conservation in Mali, that you spent a lot of time getting to know local people and what they wanted and how they viewed it, didn't you? You know, so that through that real diagnostic process, you were both able to draw them in, but really understand that they didn't want to lose the elephants either. You know,
well, that was the key thing. It was, you know, doing the studies, and then when you hit upon something that you think this is something that we can use, but you've got to recognize it. And I guess people would maybe recognize different things, or some people wouldn't see certain things, and so it's this interaction between the person and, you know, so maybe somebody else would have discounted, wouldn't have been interested in, or wouldn't have decided to search in that direction. You'd seek to try and understand that aspect of the system. They might have tried something else and tried to take it on a different trajectory.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's really interesting to bring in wisdom, and I think it also relates to how you help people or suggest to people that they are attuned to emerging shoots of change. You know, that if you're not trained to think that way, you don't kind of go, wow, that's a change. You know, that matters. You know, how do you decide, you know, that something matters?
Yes, and I think also the big shift in perspective, instead of trying to do something to a system, it's about trying to shift the context that makes certain things more probable. You want to happen. You're shifting the probability of the thing rather than attacking it directly.
Yeah, the conditions around it. Well, that's lovely. Thank you, Susan, and do put your link to your paper in the chat, because I'm sure people would love to read it. Very readable and accessible. Thank you. Elliot, how about you? You may have to unmute.
Yeah, I've just done it. I'm trying to make the leap into practice, because it's practice that I'm preoccupied with. And what's coming over to me is that the kind of practice seems to be how we, a group, an organization, cope with a world which is undoubtedly very complex. But I was also trying to connect it to what you were saying about patterns and changing patterns. And I can't connect what you're saying very easily with what can be done, not simply at a micro level, by people trying to do their best in a complex world, with how to change systems. And that was important to me because you started talking about Syria and Yemen and politics, etc. And I couldn't make that bridge between the kind of concepts you were using, which seemed to be attuned to that, and what that means for practice.
So if you took the Yemen example, then the kind of historically shaped work I did was suggested, if you looked at all the kind of drivers, the social, economic, political, and etc., it was likely to blow up. You know, that the limiting resources, the behaviour of Saudi Arabia, you know, the increasing drought and so on, it was kind of, you know, working towards, you know, a disaster. So in part, just saying that, you know, if people had been able to see that, then, you know, the kind of question for the INGO that I was working with was, so is this a time for really worrying too much about, you know, the minutiae of, you know, should your energy at this stage really be going into real attacking policy changes, you know, getting government to really see what Saudi Arabia were doing, you know, in terms of pushing migrants back and all the kind of conflicts that have happened? You know, is this a time for fiddling while Rome burns? So it may push you at that stage into something quite big. So I think it can inform where you start to think about what the solution is at that kind of level by understanding the context better. And sometimes you're looking at what the levers for change might be, and so that would be an example there. If you were looking at an organisation, I might be thinking, so for example, one organisation I worked with had really a very strong focus on sustainability that seemed very real, and I'd be wanting to suggest that in making the kind of changes to professionalise and tighten up some of their, it was quite a kind of loose, chaotic kind of organisation to actually kind of respond to that. We need to do it in a way that doesn't destroy the very thing that makes them successful. So that would be the kind of way I would think about that. So that kind of diagnostic process starts to lead you into some different conversations about what we might do, I think.
Just not to hog the space, but most policy systems that I work with or encounter are nested, and at certain levels of thinking and analysis and of behavior, there is a degree to which people can exercise some influence, if only by better understanding themselves, what's going on in their context, on that word. But it's making the links between the different levels in these nested systems that seems to me to remain a big problem. So if you're dealing with, you're dealing with something very local, you're dealing with something at a national level, you're doing something at a regional level, you're doing something at a global level, it's the alignment and the relationship between these different systems that I find troubling. But, and I haven't absorbed your book, and I haven't read it, and I haven't thought more about it, so I think I'll shut up now and leave it. But it's practice at more than just the local level that I'm trying to get my head around.
But with respect, you're taking a traditional systems view of that, and sometimes it's about, so if you take Nelson Mandela or Gandhi, or how the slave trade ended, sometimes it is the local or it is the particular that shifts things. So I think, one of the things I might share a couple of slides with you about that is that you never know. Sometimes we have a conversation with somebody and maybe they are in a position to do something that's more global, and we can think in this kind of like we have to move all the chairs to make a difference, and we're working at all these levels. But sometimes people get inspired look at Greta Thunberg, and or David Attenborough. It is possible to shift things, and sometimes conditions are such, like with the pandemic, that there's a kind of opportunity to reframe things. But I'm going to leave it there because that's a longer conversation. But I'd like to, Karina, I see you're there. You work a lot in change. Do you have a reaction to these kind of ideas about how change works and what's the balance between the big and the little and the strengthening and the disturbing? Any thoughts?
Only that it's really hard and we're wrestling with it in the moment. So this is wonderful. But I think the thing that's coming up for me is, and this is purely personal, but I think for me, the most powerful change that I'm seeing is when we go on our own personal journeys. So currently we're actually staying when we do place-based work, really, do we really want to look at policy? Because there's so many vested interests in maintaining the status quo around policies that actually it's much better if we look at, well, how are we turning up and what's the relationship we have both with ourselves and also with each other, and how do we do that from a deeply equitable lens and in relation with all beings. Feels much more important, because actually this is where we are now in the context of time, present time. This is about evolution of consciousness as a species, really. So how we are in relationship with each other enables us to pay attention to where the change is happening. And one thing that we're really thinking about in our work is actually, again, from an equitable perspective, how do we skill people up so that the skills that we are talking about here and the skills that we have around systems change and complexity is shared more widely? Because then we can effectively pivot depending on what challenge is emerging in that time and space. And so how do we skill people up, and how do we make sure that resources are liberated so that work can be done?
Beautiful, brilliant. Thank you, Karina. That's really good to add in. And there's a place in all this, and this is why it's a complex weave, and why there's no right answer. Sometimes it's a structural issue. Sometimes it is about influencing policy. Sometimes it's about exemplifying something locally, and but it is in the context, and it's something I completely agree with. That just apart from the more than human world and consciousness, that if people don't embrace complexity, really, then all they try to do all the time is to say, well, we can get a handle, complexity is bad and we can manage complexity. So some people write books, not mentioning any names, about managing complexity as opposed to embracing complexity. So it's a different kind of quality. If we think the world is complex, and that's actually the source of novelty and the future and emerging consciousness, and it's a really positive, thing, then we would go about things differently. Now I'm noticing people are leaving, which is fine, and I'm wondering about drawing this to a close. I can see there's another 2 or 3 questions, so I'm just going to ask Ian, what should we do, Ian?
Jean, if you're happy to continue, and if people unfortunately have to leave such a mind-blowing workshop, then that's unfortunate for them, I think. But if you're happy to keep going, then let's do it. You sparked off quite a few half dozen threads of new thinking for me this afternoon. So, but I want to go into that now. Thanks.
Well, it's also it's also interesting to hear to hear from others as well. Like I just really enjoyed what Karina's just said, and Susan's experience in elephants. But we've got Mike and Richard, and then I've got another couple of slides which I can share as well. So Mike, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, I suppose my question is around ethics and morality. So if you have so take the example of Chile under Allende, which where there was democratically elected the Hollande government, and then external forces, and the neoliberal invasion pretty much, which then completely undermined it. And it seems to me that, well, another example is like Brexit in this country is like there are certain forces which will basically just completely lie or do anything underhand in order to control the system. And it feels like when you have progressive, I work for Transition Network, and we're trying to affect change by supporting the transition movement to grow in this country. But sometimes you think, well, that being nice and being, having all these nice principles, does it actually hinder us from actually creating that disturbance? Because we want to be inclusive and we want to be all this, but actually what I really want to see is fundamental system change, complete change. I'm interested in, because I think where we're at now is if we don't have that, then we're heading for some serious problems. And maybe we do need to be more Machiavellian, or more, I don't know, use the same tools. I don't know. It's like, are we being caught in, are we being sort of, what's the word? Not neutered or whatever in our approach, because, we want to be nice and we've got principles.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a very valid question, and in a sense complexity theory is neutral. It's like Nazi Germany emerged and was very powerful for a long time and did things in the world, so that's true. But one of the things that I sometimes talk about is the fact that in our co-creating the future, what we put into the future system is every step we take. So my lie stays in the system, and what do we want to co-create between us? There is a given that we never end up where we thought we would be. And my example is the one about weapons of mass destruction, with a certain prime minister of ours who seemingly didn't tell the truth about what he knew about whether there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and that led to an invasion. And it was kind of predicated on an idea with him and Bush that if you chop the head off the baddie at the top of the system, that everybody will go, oh, phew, thanks for that. We'd like democracy now. Whereas of course, a leader is a kind of emergent property and perhaps of a whole complex culture. And actually just to tell a lie in order to have an outcome, which was to chop the head off, Saddam Hussein, it never got to where we thought it would get to. But what did stay in the system were the lies. And I think, one might argue that some of the real shift in the idea that, do politicians ever tell the truth? Does it really matter? Does the truth matter at all? Perhaps had some of its, maybe this is a naive comment, but maybe it went back to that example of how those lies remained. And some people love this particular prime minister, and there's a great following, believe it or not, in South Africa, where people go on about, what a fantastic job he did. And, I can't get beyond the lie, that's the lie stays with me. So there's something about, if we do give up on our principles, we are seeding the system with bad ingredients. Now, in the short term, like Nazi Germany, you might get a long way, but is that really what we want? So it's not an answer, but it's my answer, if you know what I mean. Thanks, Mike. Richard.
Hi, thanks, Jean. My as it were, sandpit for systems application is in the world of the energy systems, and it's interesting because we are now in a phase of going through a transition, going through a metamorphosis as the nature of power generation changes, and the nature of the use of information technology also changes. So whilst I was picking up on your message about the looking back on the past to see where the direction of travel might be, and that is indeed quite interesting and something I want to take away and think about. But also there is this opportunistic thing going on where you kind of spot opportunities within a particular constrained, I'm calling it a laboratory, Ian knows what I'm talking about, and seeking opportunities, but then trying to stand back and saying, oh, hang on, what is that an example of? that might be generalized, because the whole point about this kind of relatively local engagement is to think about general principles that need to be applied and then scaled up across a much larger region and the, as it were, the laboratory area. So I want to mull over a lot of things you've been saying and see how it reflects into the things that I'm involved in at the moment. So thank you very much for that.
And I wasn't trying to say that we're looking for trends from the past. I was trying to say that we inform our understanding of the present by noticing how locked in certain patterns are. It's information. It's not saying, you know, that there's something good or bad about it. It's that sort of lock-in at the same time as being opportunistic. So there's a kind of both and about, you know,
yeah.
I may have to take into account that there's certain, so, you know, how do you deal with gender issues, you know, as a woman in the world? Some of the attitudes towards women are so locked in and so unconscious that even, you know, people who are right on about it don't understand or notice how difficult it is to have a voice as a woman in the world. And I say that as somebody who's, you know, bolshy, stroppy, you know, argumentative and able to hold her own. And it's still, you know, one sits in this patterning of gender. Now, how do I both take that into account and find a way to shift some of that balance, both personally and more globally? That's those dilemmas, those kind of both ands, I think, is something I'm trying to kind of express all the time. There's always a both and about this. So I hope that helps. Okay, let me just finish off a couple of slides for anybody who's still here, and then we can all go and have a cup of tea, or I'm not telling you what I'm going to have, but it isn't a cup of tea. So just one thing I just wanted to add, which is a slightly, it doesn't quite follow from this conversation because it's not really about practice, but it's this idea of the inner and the outer. It is really what Karina and Leisha in the comments was talking about as well. There's the inner and the outer world are co-evolving. And Prigogine said this, you know, that the anticipation of the future contributes to the present, you know, that it doesn't in this kind of focus, going back to ontology, separate realism and idealism. It sees the inner world of ideas as acting in the outer world and therefore changing things. So Byrne talks about this and calls it complex realism, and he's got quite interesting on this. So there is something about the importance of the inner in creating change in the outer, which I think happens on both a kind of practical way, but happens in a much more kind of mystical way as well. And so I'm kind of interested in that kind of mystery in you know, if there's an emphasis on indeterminism, even if the very fabric of the universe is indeterministic, is indetermined, there's room for mystery and an intuition, and, you know, even a glimmer of panpsychism. You know, I won't go there today, but so the co-evolution of inner and outer, and that sometimes our beingness is what changes things. You know, there's some people I go to somebody who's an osteopath for and there's something about her presence, her beingness, that changes things in me. I find myself feeling things and saying things and behaving in ways towards her that seem to be drawn out of me by what she is, as opposed to what she does. And I think, you know, I think this kind of inner outer being as opposed to doing, and the whole kind of collective sense of you know, what is here, and how that affects us is really, you know, of interest to me. So I'm a bit weird around the edges. I'm a bit wacky too when it comes to these kind of things. So process complexity positions complexity as a processual ontology and moves beyond the distinction of things, forces, patterns, and events. It emphasizes indeterminism and uncertainty as ontological, as metaphysical concepts. Complexity is defined as the emerging, stabilizing and dissolving of empty patterns of not reified things. And this inner and the outer world are viewed as co-evolving, historically and contextually shaped, emerging dynamic patterns. So if the more ontological aspects of this, you're very welcome to have a paper and perhaps email me rather than just put something in chat if you want me to send it you, or tell Ian or something. But that was kind of where I have got to, and you know, happy to take any final comments if anybody's got any energy left, but happy to leave it there too. I really, you know, it's really nice to have the interaction as well, you know, and you all make me think too. So Richard.
Yeah, I was picking up on what Susan, I don't think she's on that anymore, but I mean, she talked about not trying to change something head on, but shifting context and conditions such that you change the probability of something good happening. And I guess if she didn't believe that she could achieve those things, she wouldn't be out in Africa trying to do that. I mean, so everyone on this thing is involved in projects where we're trying to make good things happen in our own terms. So indeterminism doesn't mean the inability to affect change. It means that, I mean, doesn't it mean that actually what pops out might not be exactly what you expected? It might actually be brilliantly serendipitous, or it might be what you wanted, but achieved through a route that you was entirely surprising. So I'm just wondering about this intentionality of wanting to affect good things, but recognizing indeterminism not as a, oh, well, we can't do anything, you know, kind of blocker on our actions, if you like, or efforts.
Yes. So absolutely. So one of the slides I use with groups sometimes is chaotic means we know nothing, and predictability means we know everything. And complexity theory says we're in the middle ground. There's lots we know. Patterns are often very stable and very beguiling. I mean, you know, people make money out of looking at the patterns in the market and do really well at it. But we've got to remember that that's not the whole story, and something else will happen. Similarly with change processes, you know, there will be a time when you say the thing to do here is to do nothing but wait and see and hold this context together and you know, work on the preconditions for change. And there's other times when you go, I'm going to do this now, and I'm not going to be democratic, you know, and I'm not going to listen to other people. I'm just going to go for it, you know, sod it, I'm right, you know, and that's sometimes the right thing. So what this context kind of says to us is we can't know everything. We know a lot, but sometimes we have to try it out and see what happens. Sometimes the feeling is that we do nothing and wait and see. There's no right answer. I can't tell you the 10-step guide to change, you know. I mean, do you remember there were large management consultancies who had 10 steps to everything?
I worked
made loads of money, you know, out of going into companies saying we don't care about your history, we don't care what you've done before, just do this, as if there's no history or context in this organization, we'll just do this. What this approach is saying is do your best to understand the context, you know, do your best to inform your actions, but act and see what happens.
And there's a real danger in analysis paralysis, in terms of, you know, waiting till you know everything before you act, and then, you know, it never happens because, you know, you're never going to know it.
Yes.
Kind of thing.
So what one phrase people use for this is, rather than ready, aim, fire, complexity theory says ready, fire, aim. So in other words, learn by doing as much as by analysis. I think the limits to analysis and the stuff Susan was talking about judgment, about wisdom. I love the word wisdom. Stephen. You're muted, Stephen.
Thanks very much, Jean. It's funny you should just use the word wisdom, because that's exactly what I was just about to say, which was, you know, what does complexity theory have to say about being wise or unwise, and or wisdom and being a bit stupid, you know, in terms of action. Is it more than suck it and see? You know, if I'm
Well, I think wisdom is a complex combination of experience, intuition, judgment, humility, talking to lots of people. You know, I developed my wisdom through immersing myself in the world, through reflecting, you know, through being, you know, through suffering, you know, through lack of confidence, you know, all that, you know, it emerges a sense of wisdom. So that's really good to use. How do I use qualitative, quantitative information? How do I know when I don't know things? You know, how do I know when to go to people? And how do I know how to take my bodily reactions to things as a form of embodied wisdom that's come out of not thin air, but out of a kind of practice of meditative, you know, committed practice to learning and to experiencing the world. Which isn't to say that complexity theory wouldn't say sometimes, you know, I'm just going to try this and see what happens, you know, and I think this is always where we're faced with, at the same time as me developing my obviously enormous wisdom, you know, through my vast experience, I'm also quite likely to go, I don't know, but let's just try and see what happens. You know, how do you both and it? It's not all about analysis. Sometimes it's about doing something in the world and learning through doing. So I think my answer to everything is yes and no.
Yeah, I'm just, it just reminds me of Sergeant Wilson in Dad's Army saying to Mannering, "Is that wise, sir?" You know, and you know, I wonder if complexity theory gives us a little bit more ammunition, if you like, or backup when we're questioning the wisdom of decisions.
Yes, well, I think there's something about the inevitability of judgment in a complex, uncertain world that is there, and the fact that you can't know everything that all the patterning, some of which are kind of hidden to us. You kind of you explore the patterns by doing. So sometimes people find out about markets through doing. It's like text messaging, for example, you know, was not a thought through strategy. It was something that people did to remotely test mobile phones, but it kind of it showed that there was an emerging and indeed huge market for something completely new that changed, you know, how we communicate, you know, through business, how we, you know, manage children, how we manage our friendships, that re-engineers, that reconstitutes our social and economic future. So it's always a bit, you know, sometimes you just try it and see what happens, and sometimes you mix this wisdom. I think is a kind of complex mix of reflecting with others about history, context, the qualitative, the quantitative, and it's wise. You know, one of the words that my colleague Peter Allen used a lot at the end of his career was humility. That of all, you know, of all the things that you get out of complexity theory, it is a sort of knowing you can't really know.
Okay, thank you.
Anyway, any other final comments before we wrap up? So
Jean, that was brilliant. Unless somebody's got anything absolutely definitely, I think you deserve a good rest after that. That was mind-blowing. As I said earlier, I knew it was going to be good, but I didn't think it was going to be that good. That was fantastic. Thank you. I'm going to go away with people know me for this. I love 2x2 diagrams, and one it's occurred to me today was persistence and resistance, and insistence and desistance are the dimension I'm going to work with. I think there is a lot around the persistence of patterns in what you said that we need to work with. And so you've stimulated a lot of thought for me, and I'm sure from the comments and the questions you had, everybody would share that. So I think you deserve a very big thank you indeed from everybody here today for what you've just done. Thank you very much for what you've done. Just say a quick thank you to Katie too for organising everything and getting us all to come to these seminars. So thanks, Katie, for your hard work on that. Jean, you deserve more than a cup of tea after this. So thank you again, and I hope that we can get the recording out available for people to see, and the chat as well. So please keep in contact and look out for that. And plenty more workshops to come. So again, thank you, Jean, and thank you everybody for coming.
No, well, thank you, everybody. It's been very enjoyable for me too, and lovely to see faces old and new. That's not an age comment. Well, I know well, and people I don't. And yes, and please be in contact if you've got any further thoughts, because it's how I learn. So I'm very happy to dialogue. Very good. Thank you very much, then.
Thank you, Jean.
Thanks, Jean. Lovely to see you.
Take care.
Bye.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Alicia.
Thank you, Jean. And Ian.
You've earned your GNT.
It's glass of red, actually. So.
Okay.
Bye.
Right.